Good afternoon, comrades. Good evening, even. Welcome back to the Communist Culture Club. Hope you enjoyed your New Year and Christmas break and all that. We're very glad to have with us once again Luke Prodromou, who is today looking for the third time at Shakespeare. He's looking at Shakespeare's Unruly Women, to be precise. We've pre-recorded this session because Luke is not 100% fit physically, so we've pre-recorded it, but the comrade is with us, as you can see. Hi, comrade. Hi, Luke.
Good
And
evening, everyone.
to answer questions afterwards. Do you want to say anything before I start showing the video?
Thank you for coming along, and I hope you continue to trickle in and still be here in just over an hour so we can have an interesting discussion of the issues I try to raise, which I think will be of some interest, I hope. Let's see.
Obviously, I've seen it before, and it's of a lot of interest. I enjoyed it greatly. Thank you, comrade.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'll share the video now, and then we'll see you again for the discussion.
Part 3 of Marxism and Shakespeare, or a vaguely Marxist or Marxian approach to Shakespeare. I don't really know what that is with reference to women. All I'm doing is doing my bit for feminism, and I hope it's within the framework of Marxism. And we'll see as we go along what you think. So our subject today is Shakespeare's Unruly Women. And I dedicate this to all the unruly women in the audience and around the world, and to Tina Workman, who I'm sure is an unruly woman. And here are some of Shakespeare's unruly women. You'll recognize some of them. Let me just say one thing. They all have something in common. Whether you recognize Katerina from Taming of the Shrew, Cleopatra, you recognize, of course, Portia from Merchant of Venice, Desdemona, what you call it from As You Like It, Rosalind, and of course, the obvious one, Lady Macbeth, bottom there. So there you go. They are. But the women we're talking about, and I say they've got something in common. I don't know whether you guessed it. You can use your chat box now. Think of social class. That's a clue. And roughly speaking, they all belong to the same social class. And here they are, according to artificial intelligence. These are Shakespeare's most prominent women in terms of the size of their role. And what hits you immediately, of course, is the size of Rosalind's role in As You Like It. Now, a previous speaker on this series said comedies should be kind of discarded because they don't have much to say to us. They're not funny anymore. I have a completely different view. I believe the comedies have a lot to say about feminism and class conflict, the rise of capitalism, the fall of feudalism, and so on. And Rosalind is a good example of how powerful a female character can be. And all actresses everywhere want to be Rosalind. I'm sure some men would like to as well, and they have indeed, as we'll discover as we go along. And Cleopatra, of course, Imogen, Cymbeline, Portia, what do they all have in common, these ladies? And they are indeed ladies. I'm not just being reactionary. They all belong to one social class. They're all at least upper class or aristocratic and belong in court circles. Well, how does Shakespeare see these aristocratic upper class women? Again, AI can have its uses, and I asked it to tell me the adjectives that Shakespeare uses most frequently about his women, these women. Can you predict what he says about them? What are his favorite adjectives and what they tell us about him or her, whether he or she was or they were? This is what AI says. If you've had a little think, you can use the chat box if you like. You can just think and participate cognitively, as I call it. Here we go. Here is what Shakespeare, according to AI, has to say about women. Wow. Oh dear. They are sweet. They are fair. They are beautiful. They're witty, chaste, divine. Oh, they sound pretty perfect to me. Honest, tender. Oh, a bit proud sometimes and cruel. Overall, though, the picture is incredibly positive. I would say artificially so. Is this a description of real women? It would be a fine thing, perhaps. Would you be flattered if you are a woman and were described in these terms? Well, we'll see how Shakespeare is full of contradictions, and this may be misleading, this picture of the frequent adjectives. It makes him sound pretty airy-fairy, I must admit, and unrealistic. But what about the working class? What was missing from those previous characters and pictures are the working class women in Shakespeare. And if we devoted a session on Shakespeare's working class women, it probably wouldn't last very long. So there aren't many of them. I've chosen 4 as an example of fairly low opinion, sadly, I have to say, he has of working class women compared to the aristocratic ladies we've just been looking at. So, beginning at top left, don't know if you recognize any of these women. From As You Like It, there is a shepherd girl called Audrey. There she is. She's the subject of the quotation at the top there. A poor virgin, son, says Touchstone, the clown, who pretends he's in love with her and wants to have a good time with her, I suppose. And he calls her a poor virgin, an ill-favored thing. Well, I look at her, she doesn't look very ill-favored to me. But anyway, but he says, mine own. I love that. A poor virgin, but mine own. And what it's telling us is that it is a quirky character. These clowns always are. And it's a quirk of his nature to have chosen this woman that no man else will have. So, in brief, she's good for a laugh and good for a bit of fun. A bit less attractive, if you like, than the heroines we saw a moment ago. Just below her, we have Doll Tearsheet. Now, her name is significant. She's, as you might know or have guessed, from Henry IV, and that's Falstaff, played by the wonderful Orson Welles in the wonderful Chimes at Midnight. And that's Doll Tearsheet, who's a prostitute. She's a charming lady, very attractive and very tender towards Falstaff, especially when he's off to war and may never come back. So she's a tender prostitute and a lovely human being. I don't think Shakespeare has anything against them. It's just a very interesting contrast with the aristocratic ladies with all their, ideal epithets. Next to them, on the right, we have Mistress Overdone, another interesting name, Overdone, and she's a brothel keeper. She's a bit of a laugh as well. But again, you see, rather crude and vulgar these working class ladies are. And the very famous, wonderful, charming malaprop of Shakespeare, Mrs. Malaprop here is called Mistress Quickly. And she is good for a laugh, as you will know. Mistress Quickly, an ambiguous name. She runs the balls in tavern where Doll Tearsheet works as a prostitute. So I suppose she's a kind of brothel keeper too, in a way. And she hosts the Prince Hal and Falstaff and all his rogue and his mates who frequent the bar there. So there you are. Those are the working class women. I'm not going to focus on them. It's a bit embarrassing, really. Shakespeare, as with all commoners, generally has a low opinion of them, as we've seen in previous webinars. But his opinions can be contradictory and challenge us very often to rethink stereotypes. But we'll leave the working class women behind for today, as there are many of them anyway. And we'll go back to the upper class ladies and to the beginning of Shakespeare's career, where he asks a question that we too are going to ask and try and answer through my examples and historical approach to this subject. Why, says Adriana from Comedy of Errors, early in Shakespeare's career, why should their liberty than ours be more? That's a good question. She's talking about men, the way her husband is out and about, doing business, getting up to all kinds of hanky-panky outside the house while she's stuck in the home, as many women were at the time. So that's the question she's asking, and she's furious. She has a sister, a younger sister, who, as always in Shakespeare, there's an older sister who's a bit radical, and a younger one who's a bit of a conventional stereotype. Her name is Luciana. And she replies to her big sister, Adriana, well, you know, the reason why men have more power than we have, their job is to bridle your will, to control, to constrain. And will, of course, is your desire, your wish, your power of choosing, but also it has a sexual connotation to keep your sexual urges in rein, as it were, the bridle of your will. And the wonderful Adriana, her riposte is great. There's none but asses will be bridled. So well said, Adriana. So she's a feisty fighter against male supremacy and oppression. And as said earlier, I'll be seeing women in Shakespeare within a historical framework. And it's very simple. I've used it in all three of these talks. And my assumption is that all of Shakespeare's plays, they all reflect one way or the other, directly or indirectly, the decline of feudalism and the birth of capitalism. And it's a painful process. And that transition, I think, is reflected in the patriarchy that we find in many of Shakespeare's plays as he looks back to the feudal age. And also, there are many examples of what I call proto-feminism in Shakespeare. And these two illustrations take us from feudalism on the left to this proto-feminist on the right. And you get 100 points if you guess who she is. She was the first woman, I think, to express very explicitly and poetically proto-feminist viewpoints. And we'll come back to this lady, this mysterious dark lady, I may call her, again and again. So, an example of what I mean by the feudal approach to women in Shakespeare. From the very well-known Taming the Shrew, Katharina, fairly early play once again, and a very ambiguous play, I think, full of contradictions. You know Katharina from the film. You must have seen this notorious, very controversial play, where Katharina, throughout the play, fights and fights like a true sister of Adriana against the oppression she faces and being treated as a piece of property to be married off to the most, if you like, the first comer. And that, in this case, it's Petruchio. He's the main guy who's courting her. And we'll come back to him later. But notice the key words that Katharina uses, which are redolent of feudalism: duty and lord, sovereign, tribute, obedience. All of this reflects the past that Shakespeare often reflects back on and reflects in his plays. So there's a well-known example of a traditional stereotype of women as the property of men who should keep quiet and do as they're told. Katharina fights and fights throughout against this stereotype, but in the end, as you see in this speech, she suddenly has a volte-face, and she tells the ladies in the audience that you should submit to your husband's domination. And we'll come back to this controversy later. But let's look at an example later in Shakespeare's career from Othello and from Emilia, who is Desdemona's maid. Poor old Desdemona, you'll know the story of Othello, whether from the play or the opera by Verdi. And she, of course, Desdemona, will be killed by a jealous husband, Othello. And at the end, Emilia, her servant, refuses to remain silent. And she gives Desdemona a lesson. And if she had listened to that lesson, she may not have died at the hands of her jealous husband. And she's saying, as you can see, that, a bit like Shylock's speech about Jews and why they're as human as Christians. And she's saying wives are as human and have the human needs that men have too. Whatever men do, we have the right to do. So we have feelings, affections, 5 senses. We have a desire for sport, which again has a sexual connotation. And we are frail sexually as men are. So let them know, these men, if they don't like what we do, it's because we're learning from them. Touche, well done, well said, Amelia, one of my favorite Shakespeare characters. And often this speech is cut, which is really disgraceful in any production which cuts this speech. This is just an extract from it. We'll come back to it later. So there are 2 examples of the feudal perspective and the proto-feminist, or the early capitalist view of womanhood. And I'll come back to that idea as well. So to sum up the historical background, this is the look back at the patriarchal society that Shakespeare often indulges in. And these were the rules that my unruly women will be breaking. Basically, women were property. They had no rights. They were property, but they had no rights to property, unless they had no brothers, in their family. So they were really treated as objects with no will, completely passive, and they had to know their place and keep quiet. Shakespeare sums this up in one of his plays when he says to a young lady, a man says, Duke Theseus, in fact, Midsummer Night's Dream, to Hermia, to you, your father, or brother, or husband, I would say, should be as a god. So that's the stereotype from the distant feudal past, which still echoes in Elizabethan England. And in that England, we find this character I showed you earlier, and I called her the Dark Lady. And she was the first woman in England, and I think a heroine, I could call her that, of the feminist movement, one of the founders historically of feminism. She was the first to publish poetry under her own name. Because posh people in those days usually avoided using their own names because they were kind of ashamed of writing poetry. That includes the men, of course, and this rare example of a woman writing poetry under her own name. And indeed, she challenges feudalism and patriarchy in this poetry. I don't know if anybody of you know who she is. I can give you a clue if you've been reading the papers recently. A novel by a famous American novelist, Jodi Picoult. I've never heard of her, but I'm told she's a bestseller. Wrote a whole novel about this lady, and a very controversial novel it is too. I've read it actually, but it's not my kind of book. But it's interesting that Jodi Picoult chose Emilia Lania Bassano, as she's called, as the subject of her novel, about this very libertarian woman, this very proud woman who in reality wrote poems like this. And as you can see, the key words save you poring over this text. I've highlighted that the subject of the poem I'm giving you here is the equality between the sexes. She's arguing, like Adriana, like Emilia in Shakespeare, for the liberty of women. And she challenges the sovereignty, feudal word there, of men. And she blames their seeing them as weak and treating them cruelly because, of course, of Eve's fall. And Eve had a lot to answer for, you see. And what she's saying, Emilia here, is that it's not her fault, the other women of her generation, that this story in the Bible suggests that women are to blame for everything. And she tells the men, you wouldn't be here without our pain. So, there's no justification for being cruel to us. We are your mothers. We go through a lot of pain to give you birth. And they want to be free, these women, be equal and free from tyranny. Powerful stuff. Not a bad poem at all. If one weak woman, that's Eve, of course, simply did offend this sin of yours hath no excuse, nor end, to which poor souls we never gave consent. So don't blame us for Adam and Eve and all that nonsense. So there she is, Emilia Lania Bassano, a courtesan. She was in the court, and she was literally a courtesan. She was the mistress of one of the most powerful aristocrats in the kingdom, the Lord Chamberlain, Hunsdon. And she had a child by him. And then he dumped her onto an Italian, because she's of Italian origin too, and a musician. Her family were a musician's family that Henry VIII brought over from Italy. And Emilia was educated as an aristocrat, a very knowledgeable woman. And as I say, her story is very, very interesting. And she's had a great influence in many ways, and we'll come back to her once again soon. And I'm going to use a posh word here, excuse me, the zeitgeist. I think we should talk a little bit about the spirit of the times, the Elizabethan era, what ideas were floating around in the air, and how these influenced Shakespeare, and how they may explain some of the contradictions we find in his presentation of women. So what do I mean by the zeitgeist? I think that's probably a wrong pronunciation, but we're pretty. Well, you can't talk about the spirit of the age, in England at least, without talking about Elizabeth I. Like her or not, she was on the throne for a long time. She was a very powerful woman. And quite specifically, she rejects the idea that all women are weak. She says she's as strong as any man and as strong as a king of England. And though the sex to which I belong is considered weak, and it was indeed, as we've just seen with Emilia Lania, you nevertheless find me a rock that bends with to no wind. And she rejects men as her master. Now, as you know, she never married, but she had lots of friends, male friends, perhaps lovers, Leicester and Essex and all the rest of them, Christopher Hatton, many, many men. She loved the attention of men, but she didn't want them to boss her around. So I think we should take her into account. Many of Shakespeare's heroines probably influenced by Elizabeth and were probably created to flatter Elizabeth when she saw the plays at the court. And of course, another very important aspect of the ideas of the age, which are responsible to some extent for the concept of women being weak. And yet I'm going to argue paradoxically that the Reformation also indirectly led to women becoming stronger. You will recognize at least two of these reformers in Germany and Switzerland, I believe, France, Switzerland on the right. So I don't want to state the obvious. I'm sure you guessed the guy on the left, who is Martin Luther, the guy on the right, who is John Calvin, and they, of course, were the chief leaders of the Reformation against Catholicism, its rituals, and its Latin Bible, and so on. Very important movement, I think, and we'll see why. Chap in the middle is also a very important Protestant figure, anti-Catholic, and he was one that Engels singled out as a precursor of Marxism. If you can guess his name, or if you know it, again, you get top marks. I discovered it through my preparation for this talk, and this is what Engels said about Munzer, Thomas Munzer, who led a peasants' revolt in Germany against one of the princes as part of the Reformation. He was executed in the end, but he wanted lower taxes, justice for ordinary commoners, peasants, and he paid the price. So I can see why Engels looked back with admiration at Thomas Munzer, with his radical views on equality. And as I say, these ideas of the reformers of the Protestant Reformation weren't directly feminist, but ideas like radical equality, of course, and other aspects of Protestantism would help women to become potentially more autonomous and recognized for their individuality. Calvinism, of course, made a big contribution, according to Max Weber, as you all know, to the idea of capitalism and how it came about, the aspects of the Reformation and the Calvinist strain of the Reformation that connect with capitalism are, of course, the individual, the focus on the individual, the virtues of hard work. If you're one of the elect, this idea was developed later, that your hard work and success, your thrift, your efficiency, select you as one to be saved through your works, as it were. So it's associated with these qualities that led to industrial organization and capitalism. And you'll know this from R.H. Tawney, great book. But on the other hand, Luther and Calvin, for all their radicalism towards Catholicism and their beliefs in the individual's right to believe as he or she wished, considered women an important part of human nature, of course, but the weakest part. And it all goes back to Adam and Eve and the Bible. So the Bible, in a sense, has a lot to answer for punishing half the population or giving, religious people the pretext to punish their wives and daughters. But a slightly different story of a great Protestant is that of Tyndale, William Tyndale. And you'll know why he's famous, no doubt, because of his insistence on translating the Latin Bible, or the Greek, if you like, into English, which he did, because he believed every believer, individual, had the obligation and the right to understand the Bible in their own language, not some Latin mumbo jumbo that they couldn't really understand. And priests had to mediate. And, all these other weaknesses of Catholicism, he, in practice, challenged by translating the Bible. He was the first to do it. And the important thing is that this attitude towards the education of commoners is progressive by definition. And commoners will include women, although women at the end of the day were silenced. Their voices were suppressed because of the Bible. Again, you can't get away from it because the Protestants also revered the Bible. So women were, I think, given some impetus to express their individuality. But the Reformation, with the closure of the convents, didn't help much, because in the convents, women would very often get a very good education, become very sophisticated. And when Henry VIII closed them and robbed them, the women were, ended up once again in feudal terms with, in the role of wife and mother. Who doesn't have to say very much or do very much apart from, do the housework and be protected by her. So there's the wonderful William Tyndale, who, like Thomas Munzer, paid the price for his beliefs. And he was vindicated, as you know, in the end, because the King James Bible, 1611, is about 70% at least shaped by Tyndale's brilliant translation in English. So there you go. So moving on. There we are. Another aspect of the zeitgeist we can say is humanism. And there's a painting by Raphael, which many of you will recognize, which captures the spirit of humanism, which I think is interesting to couple with Protestantism because of the questioning of received wisdom of the Catholic Church. So the humanists, as you know, this is the school of Athens, this painting, look back to the Greeks and the Romans and their curiosity about life in their own secular way, science, philosophy, mathematics, and they admired these philosophers a great deal, Aristotle, Plato, and Leonardo da Vinci, who's in there, I think, in the role of Plato. But it's a fascinating painting where the Renaissance in Europe is painted at the same time as painting ancient Greek philosophers. And it captures the spirit of questioning that we associate with humanism, although it wasn't always anti-religious, but One of the original humanists that I'm going to look at in connection with Shakespeare is this chap, who was a poet and often considered the first humanist, an Italian. He wrote sonnets to Laura. Can you guess what his name is? And he had a direct influence on the sonnets of Shakespeare, but in a very interesting way, as we shall see. Now, this great humanist and sonneteer is Petrarch. And look at the way he presents women, old Petrarch. Amazing. If you go back to those adjectives I showed you, describing women, here we have Laura, this unrequited love for Laura, who is unlike a mortal. She's immortal. She's like an angel. No human voice can compare to her voice or describe her. And she's a heavenly spirit. She's up there in the skies, not down here on the earth. A living sun. That's what Francesco Petrarch says about the beautiful, perfect, unreachable, unattainable, cruel-hearted Lord. Poor old Petrarch. And he wrote dozens of poetry like this about poems about Laura. And to put him in a nutshell and the way he sees Laura, she is heaven. She's in heaven. She is heavenly. She is the sun. She's everything. She's up there. High up. What does AI say about Petrarch and Laura? I asked it to tell me. How does Petrarch describe her eyes? Give me the adjective. Let's see what all the words that we can learn, the metaphors, the similes. Wow. The sun, light, fire, angel, flame, crystal, star. She is absolutely unbelievable, immaterial. All beauty, all things beautiful are there in Laura. Why do I point this out? Why is Laura and her eyes so important to Shakespeare's studies and women in Shakespeare? Well, I wonder if you can remember when Shakespeare mentions the sun in one of his sonnets. But before I show you what Shakespeare does with the Petrarchan sonnet, which had a big influence on his predecessor, Philip Sidney, who copied Petrarch, his Laura was called, what was her name? Stella. You see, she's up there in the stars, in the heavens. And he was Astrophil, Philip Sidney, Astrophil and Stella. Very Petrarch in every aspect of the poetry, Astrophil and Stella, the series of sonnets. But before we look at Shakespeare, it was a very different kettle of fish. How would we describe, if we were writing a poem about our true love, male or female? Can you think about your lover, male, female? You want to write a poem about how beautiful their eyes are. Which words are you going to use? What are her eyes like? Think of a simile, a metaphor, before I show you Shakespeare's trick, which is this. He takes the sonnet, and this is what he does with it. My mistress eyes, my mistress eyes. Unlike yours, Petrarch, unlike yours, Sir Philip Sidney, my mistress eyes are nothing like the bleeding sun. If you were Tony Harrison, it's probably what he'd write. Great poet, Tony Harrison. But Shakespeare says, no, she's not divine. She is not heavenly. She is like this. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, Yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. Yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. You can see why I think Shakespeare here is having a direct dialogue with Petrarch, the great humanist, who idealized women, and Sir Philip Sidney, who had a fantasy about his Stella, which was completely unreal. Now, whether it flatters women or not, I don't know, to be described in terms of absolute perfection, all things bright and beautiful. But Shakespeare says, no, my missus is, not very nice at all, really, in conventional terms. And the pictures I showed you are the 4 leading candidates for the so-called Dark Lady. This last one here, you will recognize, she's the most popular candidate for the Dark Lady. And her name is, as we said, Emilia Lania Bassano, and she's a hot favorite. But we're not sure. The first one I showed you was a black woman, Lucy Negro, and there was Mary Fitton, and another one whose name I can't remember now. 4 leading candidates. All of them, according to Shakespeare, are very imperfect beauties. You can see for yourselves what he means. I don't have to labor the point. But it's interesting at the end where he says, I never saw a goddess. So that's what Sidney and Petrarch describe their women as, goddesses. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. So he's literally looked up to heaven. What a genius this man was, as Petrarch was doing. And he brought the women down to earth, which is what he'll do in some of his plays as well. And yet, look at that final couplet, yet by heaven, the ironic use of heaven, not literally, but it's an exclamation, an ironic emphasis. He's really unlike Sidney, unlike Petrarch. I think my love is rare. Rare means both rare and also beautiful. As any she belied with false compare. You see how wonderful that poem is. Now, I'll leave it to the unruly women in my audience to decide which poetry they would like to be addressed to them. A Petrarchan sonnet, where they are divine, or a Shakespearean sonnet on the Dark Lady, which is less than divine. All too human, all too frail. So, before we leave the sonnets, I should mention one more aspect of these wonderful poems, 152 of them. Most of them, as you will know, 2/3 of them are not addressed to the Dark Lady at all. They're not addressed to a woman at all. They're addressed to a man. I don't know if you know the man here on the right. You may say, well, that's not a man, that's a woman. Well, that's the whole point. Shakespeare writes this sonnet about this fair youth. He's in love with this fair youth, as we can see. A woman's face, with nature's own hand painted, hast thou, nasty mistress, my passion. This is the same man, Shakespeare, who's writing about the Dark Lady in such original ways. And here we have a very original Oscar Wildean poem about the fair young youth. And Oscar Wilde obviously did follow Shakespeare along this path. And he wrote a special book about the sonnets, Oscar Wilde. We will come back to the idea of gender bend, as I call it, in Shakespeare. It begins in the sonnets, or I've begun with the sonnets, and it's very homoerotic. You read all of this poem, very famous one, The Master Mistress of My Passion. It puns, very crudely about sexual relationships between men. He uses the word prick as a verb with obvious connotations. and nature pricked thee out for others' uses, he says of the fair youth, was probably the Earl of Southampton. In case you hadn't guessed, he is the most likely candidate, the addressee of many, well, the Venus and Adonis and Rape of Lucrece is this fair youth, the Earl of Southampton, and he's probably the subject of the sonnets. 2/3 of them are about this man. We'll come back to this idea of gender bending and his exploration of different aspects of sexuality in his poems and plays. And to finish with humanism, a word about the great Erasmus. Just before Shakespeare was born, he left his fingerprints, his thoughts in the spirit of the age. I just want to highlight his focus on women and their education, a progressive view for its time. But in the end, Erasmus, for all his open-mindedness and belief in the individual dignity and potential of humanity, still thought women belonged in the home as good caregivers. But it had a great deal of respect for women and people he disagreed with. He was a very dialectical thinker and not at all dogmatic. Attached to the Catholic Church, but quite open to ideas from Luther, with whom we had a long correspondence. The great Erasmus and his focus on individualism and the wonders of human nature, which we see reflected in the very humanist play of Hamlet. And we'll see an irony and a huge contradiction in the way Hamlet sees man in humanist terms, very much in the spirit of Erasmus, in this famous monologue, where he praises the nobility of man. What a piece of work is man. Notice the gender, how noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. This is all very Renaissance, looking back to the Greeks, looking back to Erasmus and people like that. In action, how like an angel. In apprehension, how like a god. The beauty of the world, a paragon of animals. So human beings are up there with the greats, with the angels, and embodiments of reason, scientific curiosity. Wonderful stuff. But yet, when Hamlet comes to women, he turns out to be a bit of a misogynist. When his mother betrays him, he feels her frailty, marriage to Claudius, husband's brother, frailty, thy name is woman. You see, he's shocked and very misogynistic about his mother. But then we take Ophelia, his lover, or potentially the girl he's going to marry, the daughter of, Polonius, Ophelia. And he's very angry with her and gives her a very rough time. He tells her to get thee to a nunnery. This poor girl. Nunnery is a brothel as well as a convent, you'll know that perhaps, and become a prostitute. Why wouldst thou be a breeder of sinners? So on two levels, whether you see it as being closed up in a nunnery, being totally asexual, or being a prostitute, it's not good news for women. A bit of a misogynist here is Hamlet. So he's certainly not a perfect example of a humanist in many ways, but he expresses humanism. And as I say, Shakespeare is full of contradictions, and that's one very good example. So we go back now to patriarchy, having given the historical outline, the spirit of the age. In terms of ideas, we come back to the idea of a patriarch, father or brother or husband, and how it's expressed in other ways. Take the wonderful Midsummer Night's Dream. Like many plays, it explodes in the first scene with an expression of patriarchy and anger towards women. And here, Theseus, the Duke, played by Ian McKellen here, is telling Hermia to question her desires, like Adriana, whose will has to be bridled. Poor old Hermia who wants to marry somebody else, not her father's choice, is told to question her sexual, probably, as well as choice, the meaning of desires there, or forever renounce the society of men, to go into a nunnery once again, or die the death. So she could die if she doesn't do what her father tells her to marry Demetrius and not there's a difference. Anyway, that's what Hermia wants, and she's treated by her father as a piece of property, as I say here, to be disposed of as he wishes. And he's got the backing of the law of Athens. She's mine. I may dispose of her as I wish, you see, like a piece of merchandise or real estate, which shall be either to this gentleman or to her death. Pretty harsh words for a comedy. There are no comedies in Shakespeare. They're all problem plays, posing questions. Hermia and Lysander, they reject all of this nonsense. And the two young couples, Helena, Lysander, Demetrius, and anyway, Hermia, Helena, Lysander, Demetrius, that's right. They run off to the forest. There's often Shakespeare. You run away from the oppressive court, the corrupt court, from the oppressive state, from the oppressive law, and your family, and you go to the woods somewhere where everything can be turned upside down. The world, indeed, turned upside down, where anything can happen and anything does happen in A Midsummer Night's Dream. They're going to escape the sharp Athenian law. And that's what they do. Partners swapping. Once they're there, they think they're in love with X, but they make love to Y, and so on. A lot of hanky-panky going on there. And the greatest of all the unruly women, perhaps in Shakespeare, the whole of Shakespeare, at least in A Midsummer Night's Dream, is the fairy, fairy queen, Titania, who nevertheless is all too human when she has an urge to make love to a donkey, Bottom the weaver. You see, it's a great example of, sexual liberation, bestiality, you name it. It's all in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And people falling in love with whatever happens to come to sight, literally. So the magic potion, I suppose, of eroticism and how it distorts people's perceptions. So she's about as unruly as they come. Great play. But I think a problem. It ends happily, of course, with marriage. And that's what makes it a comedy. That's about all there is. It is funny in places as well. I've played it and love it deeply as a play. But let's go to the Taming of the Shrew. And back to patriarchy. There's Caterina once again, the rebel, the fighter, and there's Petruchio, Elizabeth Taylor, as you know, Richard Burton. The important thing about Caterina is that she wants to be sold off, or she doesn't want to be sold off to the highest bidder by her father. And here she is telling her father, what do you want to do? You want to make me a stale amongst these mates? So she's pointing to the men who come to marry her. She rejects all of them. She doesn't want to get married. She wants to be like Queen Elizabeth, I told you. There are women in the plays which flatter Queen Elizabeth's choice of not choosing to get married. And a stale, by the way, is a prostitute. It's a slang word for prostitute. The Taming of the Shrew. Fantastic play, apart from the very problematic ending. And you know what I'm talking about, because sometimes people think it's so reactionary at the end, after 90% of it being this feminist woman, Caterina, fighting back like this against the men. There's Petruchio, and she knows he wants her for the money. He says so. I came to Padua to wive it wealthily. You see, Petruchio's down on his luck. He's a posh guy, but he needs money, as we often find in Shakespeare's plays. And Caterina's got lots of money. And they have these wonderful debates and slanging matches, and she gives as much as she takes, the waspish Caterina. And there's a lot of sexual innuendo. And if you go further and you explore this dialogue and the other dialogues, they get more and more almost pornographic if you know what all the puns are referring to. But we won't go any further because we'll get arrested or something. But there they are having a good old ding-dong, Petruchio and Caterina. But the problem is that I refer to what makes it a problem play. It's in the last 5 minutes, we get this sudden reverse, this satanic ex machina, where suddenly Caterina reverses her position and tells the women in the audience to behave like a feudal wife, to submit, to show duty to their prince, who is their husband, and do as they're told. Completely conventional point of view, contrasting profoundly, and I think ironically, with the rest of the play. When people say it shouldn't be put on because it's reactionary and encourages abuse of women, I think it's absolute nonsense. It's there to debate, to generate discussion. And in Shakespeare's time, many of you may not know, there was a kind of follow-up to The Taming of the Shrew called The Tamer Tamed by one of Shakespeare's contemporaries. So The Taming of the Shrew is part of a theatrical debate on the role of women. And we should look into that historical background before we reject Shakespeare as just reactionary. Because 90% of the play, I would say, is feminist. The last few minutes are poking fun at this feudal idea, in my view, but you're welcome to disagree. Look at Othello. Explosion of patriarchy and death for women who don't obey their father. This time it's Desdemona, and he is shocked that she has run off with Othello. She's stolen from him like a piece of property, and as far as he's concerned, she's dead if she doesn't do as he wants and not marry this black man, Othello. And look at what she says, this wonderful Desdemona, tragic Desdemona, and I'll tell you why in a minute, from my point of view. She's not a moth of peace. She's tough, she's brave, she's innovative, she's radical. Why? She loved the Moor, the black guy, and she went to live with him in the 16th century in Venice, of course, where everything happens. But anyway, she pays no attention to the fact that he's black. She saw Othello's visage in his mind, and to his honor and his valiant parts did I my soul and fortunes consecrate. So that, dear Lovelace, I be left behind, a moth of peace, and he go to the war. The rights for which I love him are bereft me. So she wants to go to the war as well with her husband, not stay at home like Erasmus's, Luther's ideal woman. So Shakespeare goes beyond Luther, beyond Erasmus, beyond Calvin. That's why I love him. And this is Desdemona. But why does she die a tragic death? Because in the end, the remnants of feudalism are running in her blood, in her culture. And look at the language she uses about her father and about her husband, Othello. The key words I've highlighted. And they explain the paradox, the irony in which she's trapped and why she dies. Because these words silence her when she most needs to speak. Duty, 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 3 times. Due, 4 times. My Lord, Lord. You see what I'm getting at? She's transferring her allegiance from her father to the next man, her husband, Othello. Well, that's all well and good. But when things start going wrong, you have to forget this allegiance to remain silent and obedient. And she doesn't do that. And she pays the price, as we shall see. Romeo and Juliet, not at all romantic, soppy stuff. It's hard-hitting. almost pornographic, as it's been called by many critics. But here I'm pointing out to another father, Capulet, who sees poor old Juliet as baggage, again, property, you see. He can do what he likes with it. And tells her to shut up, speak not, reply, don't answer me, my fingers itch. He's threatening her with physical abuse. Shakespeare is there, Me Too, long before Me Too was even thought of. And we'll see him in other plays where he's a precursor of the Me Too movement. So what is he? What is his daughter? What is wrong with her behavior? She's chosen to fall in love with Romeo, an enemy of the family, the Capulets, the Montagues, as you know. And here she is. I'm going to show you just one speech as she's waiting for Romeo for the first night of sex and love and passion. This girl is 13 years old, getting on for 40. And this is what she says about her anticipating sexual experience.
Gallop apace, you fiery-footed steeds, towards Phoebus' lodging. Such a wagoner as Phaethon would whip you to the west and bring in cloudy night immediately. Spread thy close curtain, love-performing night, that runaways' eyes may wink and Romeo leap to these arms, untalked of and unseen. Come, gentle night, come, loving, black-browed night, give me my Romeo, and when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night.
There you are. I've left out some of the best lines, most erotic lines, because there's just no space for them in this speech. But even so, you can see on more than one level what this young lady is saying and how special and powerful a character she is, who wants desperately to break away from feudal bonds. And her expression of sexuality in this language of night and love performing and come, loving black-browed night, and die, I've highlighted, because many of you will know the double meaning of die in Elizabethan English from the French. And it's, on one level, you can see it as perfectly innocent, a passion that she's anticipating, a sexual passion. And then, of course, there's Shakespeare with his double meanings, as very often in the play Romeo and Juliet, pointing to very explicit sexual experiences. But I think she's a very wonderful character, very powerful, and dies tragically because she is the new individual, the female individual, aristocratic, of course, or upper class at least, who pays the price for breaking the feudal bonds with Romeo. Wonderful. Another quick example, Much Ado About Nothing, another comedy, but very much another problem play. Again, death is there for the poor woman who doesn't do as her father says. Her hero's father turns against the hero, is the heroine. There she is of Much Ado, or one of the heroines, the other one we'll see in a second. And she's accused by her new husband, the posh aristocratic Claudio, that she's a whore, that she's had an affair with somebody else. So he rejects her, her father rejects her and welcomes her death. Here we go again, the same old motif. Either do as I tell you or you die the death. And the man, the husband and the father are equally guilty here. But Much Ado About Nothing, of course, nothing is a pun, sexual pun, as well as the word nothing. It's very common sexual connotation in Shakespeare's Elizabethan English. But we have the great Beatrice, who was a different kind of woman altogether. Very critical of men and satirical in her description of men, and Benedict is similarly a bit of a cynic, but in the end they fall in love. When they do finally fall in love, because it is comedy after all, they will get married. She tells him to kill this horrible snob, Claudio, for abusing her friend, Hero, in such a way. And she wishes twice that she were a man. Oh, that I were a man, I would eat his heart in a marketplace. So she tells Benedict to go and finish him off for treating this other innocent woman, and she's innocent, Hero, this atrocious way. So there's another feminist, unruly woman in Much Ado About Nothing. I said I'd come back to gender bending, and it all begins really gender bending in Shakespeare, not with the sonnets at all, but with the boy actor, a convention of the boy actor who played the women, and the convention of cross-dressing, where the woman, played by a boy, then gets dressed up as a woman, and in one case, who then pretends to be a man. We'll come back to this confusing chain of gender in a minute. But it's very important because it's a convention that automatically obliges the actor who's playing the woman to suggest the masculinity. And when these women pretend to be boys, as they often do, they have to be convincing boys. So they have to learn the discourse of masculinity to be convincing on the stage. So I think it's inherently the boy actor convention, a radical and progressive, although reactionary convention at the same time, where women were not allowed to appear stupidly on the stage. But the fact that boys played them and pretended to be men shows that women could do what men do, to be convincing on the stage. And you see this in Portia, for example, in A Merchant of Venice, where in the feudal world of Belmont, she's a fine lady who has to do what her dead father has dictated, to marry the man who chooses the correct casket. That's the feudal world of Belmont. When she goes to Venice, dressed as a man, remember she's been played by a boy in the original. She has to be a man who's in control, who is the judge, who takes initiative and challenges the stereotype of patriarch. Just by definition of pretending to be a man, she can do it. And we see it on the stage, that women can be as effective as men. You see when they're acting the parts. And we see it again in As You Like It with a great Rosalind. Here the two friends are cursing their fate, which has been unfair to women, not treating them equally, and lacking in gifts to women, as Rosalind says. And they, of course, escape from all this inequality and oppression by going off to the Forest of Arden, where Rosalind pretends, remember Rosalind is being played by a boy, now pretends to be a man, a boy, another boy called Ganymede. And her friend asks her, what shall I call thee when thou art a man? So she's going to have a sex change, basically, to pretend to be a man. It's very modern in its way, unintentionally, but she's going to be Ganymede, and the name is interesting, because if you know who Ganymede was, you wonder what Shakespeare's getting at here. For those in the know, Ganymede, to the people in the audience, probably aristocrats, most of them, who would understand this Greek mythological reference, quite obscure, I think even then, perhaps not so as it is today. But it's a symbol, I think, Ganymede, of modern homosexuality of the gay community, because Ganymede was the most beautiful of mortals, and old Zeus or Jove fell in love with this young man and had him amongst all his other conquests as his cupbearer and, of course, his partner. That's the way they did things on Olympus in those days. So it's a homoerotic story in the original Greek myth, and it makes As You Like It fairly homoerotic as well, when you get Ganymede pretending to be Rosalind and her boyfriend, Orlando, not knowing, of course, that it's a disguise, is pretending to be falling in love with the young man who's pretending to be Rosalind. It's very confusing, isn't it? But basically, it's the story of the sonnets retold, the master mistress of my passion. There's the Earl of Southampton, you remember, a woman's face with nature's own hand painted, as thou the master mistress of my passion. There it is. And what we see in As You Like It is, this is a man, as you can see, Orlando, and this is Rosalind, played by a black actor, Adrian Lester. And we begin with a boy actor who pretends to be Rosalind, who pretends to be Ganymede, who pretends to be Rosalind. And then, of course, in the end, she is exposed as Rosalind. Underneath it all, she's still the boy actor. She will address the audience at the end, both as a boy and as a girl, if you read the end of the play. So it's a fascinating play, As You Like It. God forbid that we should not perform these plays anymore. They say so much about sexuality, gender, and their connection to feudalism, the rise of capitalism. 12th Night, here we go. Viola. She's doing the same trick. She's played by a boy, and she dresses up as a man, Cesario. And she's both a man and a woman. And this leads to some confusion when her master, Orsino, this is Cesario now, Viola's disguise as a boy, called Cesario, a young man, is the search, she becomes the servant, as he, Cesario. And her master is Orsino, who loves Olivia. Olivia falls in love with Cesario, who is really a woman, but she doesn't know she's a woman. And she falls in love. See how confusing it can be. It's all comedy of errors, really. Later in Shakespeare's career, what will become of this entanglement of genders and sexuality? It's very confusing. How is it resolved? It's resolved then, I think, in a very problematic way, which will lead us to our final theme of silence. Cesario, says Orsino at the end. He's a boy, remember, a man, Cesario, but he's Viola in disguise. When he discovers that she is in fact a woman, he decides to drop Olivia altogether and to marry Viola instead. You see? Cesario, come, for so you shall be while you are a man. But when in other habits you are seen, Orsino's mistress and his fancy's queen. So, I don't know whether Viola wants to be married to him. She does have a soft spot for him, as she tells us. But we don't hear her response. She's silent at the end of 12th Night. One of my favorite plays, I was Sir Toby Belch once in my youth. I love the play, This Side Idolatry. But it has a very weird ending for a comedy. Of course, everybody has to get married to somebody. Olivia will marry her twin brother, Viola's twin brother, Sebastian. Orsino will marry his twin sister, Viola. And he's only just discovered that she's actually a woman. He thought she was a man. So you see what I mean about gender bending. But the rest is silence. We end with the silence of Viola at the end of 12th Night. Does she want to marry him? You know, they've hardly gone out. They've hardly got to know each other. You know, in the twinkling of an eye, he decides he wants to marry her. Why doesn't she speak? She lost her voice? Ah, she speaks, says Harriet Walter in her new book. Harriet Walter is a great Shakespearean actress, played many of the roles we've been discussing. And in her fascinating little book, she gives female characters from Shakespeare speeches which she thinks they should have spoken, but didn't, because in those days, women, as we've seen, were expected to know their place, to be silent, not to speak. So, taking my cue from Harriet Walter, we see Isabella in Measure for Measure, who is the object of Angelo's lust. Angelo is the embodiment of state power, and he wants to rape her and blackmails her in all kinds of ways if she doesn't submit to his sexual passion. But she says, I'm a nun. I'm chaste. I don't believe in all this stuff. Leave me alone. And she wants to tell the public, tell the world. She's been threatened like this, abused. But who would listen, she says? To whom should I complain? Did I tell this? Who would believe me? And you see, Angela knows, like Weinstein, Jimmy Savile, and the other guy, Epstein. What's his name? You know, him. Say what you can, he says. My false overweighs your true. When I lie about our relationship, people will believe me, not you, but just a woman. But the deus ex machina here is the Jew, the good Jew, who is good, but he does something very funny at the end. The last few minutes of the play, he decides he wants to marry Isabella. But she's a nun, you idiot. You know, can't you see? But he likes her. She's so virtuous. Give me your hand and say you will be mine, says the good Duke in Measure for Measure. And what does Isabella say? Nothing. We don't hear her response. Silence. Emilia, to finish, with the woman's voice, which Harriet Walter did not need to supply because Shakespeare did it for her. Iago, the villain in Othello, tells her to charm her tongue to shut up. And she says, I will not charm my tongue. I won't shut up. I am bound to speak. I will speak as liberal as the North to save Desdemona from herself. You remember she tells Desdemona what men are really like. She's warning her to fight Othello, to resist, to speak out against the false accusations of having affairs. And we're answering the question I began with. Why should their liberty than ours be more? And Emilia will tell us why in this final speech. Desdemona, as I said, dies because of the concept of duty and her lord, and this leads to her being silent when she should speak up for herself. But Emilia gives her this advice at the end, before she's killed Desdemona.
I think it is their husbands' faults if wives fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign laps, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us, or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have gulls, and though we have some grace, yet have we some revenge. Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell, and have their palates both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And does affection breed it? I think it does. Is frailty that thus hers? It is so too. And have not we affections, desires for sport and frailty as men have? Then let them use us well. Else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so.
Good old Emilia. I think that speaks for itself. If you don't know the speech, go back, study it. It speaks for itself, and which is what I wanted to finish on, the note of a woman speaking for herself against the patriarchy that has oppressed women for so long and still does to some extent, as we can see here. In Scotland, a few years back, I collected this news item about a law banning forced marriage. It has no place in the 21st century, whereas in Shakespeare it was common currency, and forcing women to suffer in silence when they're victims of forced marriage. By passing this law, the Scottish government has given a voice to a silent minority. which is what we've been trying to do in this presentation, which I think Shakespeare does to a large extent, often within the framework of the contradictions which characterize him and his faithful expression of the spirit of his own age. And I'll leave you with this question, this debate. 2 points of view by Adrian Noble, my old university director, who then went on to be RSC director for many years, artistic director. And old Adrian says that Shakespeare was reactionary, a bourgeois, monarchist, and a conservative. I think he himself is quite left-wing, actually, Adrian Noble. That's the conclusion in true about Shakespeare. But Juliet Stevenson, a woman, actress, and a great one, says we don't know what Shakespeare was and we don't care. The plays ask the most anarchic questions. That's the key word. They don't attempt to resolve them. Why should? Well, we, as progressive people in the 21st century, might try to resolve them, and we should. These questions are important. These contradictions are not easy to resolve, but you decide who you agree with. Adrian Noble, Shakespeare was just a Tory, a monarchist, or Juliet Stevenson, who says he's challenging us every time in all these plays to ask questions. And that's what I believe. So apart from Harriet Walter's book, here are 3 other books I've been influenced by in the years past: Shakespeare and the Nature of Women, great book, 2nd edition, Juliet Duesenberg. I've quoted Elliot Krieger before, A Marxist Study of Shakespeare's Comedies, and the wonderfully named Penny Gay. She stole my title, I'm sure she did. Shakespeare's Unruly Women, as she likes it. So I read her book some years back. I can't remember whether I got this title from her or not, but anyway, it's not my exclusive property by any means. So thank you to these wonderful writers, Penny Gay, Juliet, and Elliot Krieger, for their help, and thank you for listening. Any questions, I'm here to answer, discuss things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, comrade. If you could switch on your camera now, Luke.
Yes, here I am.
Thanks very much, Luke. That was a brilliant presentation covering a wide range of issues and subjects. So thank you very much. Well done on that. There's another book, isn't there? We talked about it briefly about, I think it's called Let Us Speak.
I quoted it. Where were you?
Yes, sorry. But in the end, you put it down as a picture.
Harriet Walter's book.
That's the one.
You recommended it to me. I read it. I used it. I integrated it. And I had a slide. You must pay more attention.
Oh, at the end, I mean, at the end.
Yeah, I'll forgive you. I said you were unruly right at the beginning.
Yes.
You see, you proved my point.
Very good. Comrades, if anybody would like to ask a question, make a contribution, please click raise hand and we can make you into panelists. Now you mentioned, I mean, this is quite interesting. You did mention this is of course all produced in the period from feudalism to capitalism. So it reflects all these changes that were taking place in that really sort of very fruitful political period, exciting political period, because it was going different ways. So feminism, you know, it probably doesn't exist as a term then, I would have guessed, but certainly the role of women is looked at is very interesting. And you know, and they are not revolutionaries, Shakespeare's women, but they do break the rules, and that's how you presented it. I think that's really very interesting. It doesn't touch, of course, on the more historical role of women. We had a bit of a discussion in the chat. We don't have to go into too much detail about that. But of course, further back in history, women and men lived together, much more egalitarian. And there was a period when women had to be put in their place and had to become property so that men could prove this is my child, so I can leave my property to my child. Is this kind of it that doesn't find any reflection in Shakespeare, that further back history, does it?
Not that I've noticed at all, Tina. No, not really. I think the big break seems to come with religion. If that state is, primitive communism, let's call it, if when it existed, I think the echoes have probably faded, and religion had been around long enough to replace, I think, any such influences, and seems to have dominated the previous centuries, right up to the Reformation, as I said, and the beginning of the questioning of the, Christian inheritance and religion generally. And I think that is a very interesting threshold, a turning point, which directly or indirectly, I think, began a process of liberation, where, as we saw time and again, the question of equality with men kept being raised, whether in Shakespeare or in other sources. It was there, and somebody had to begin to focus on it. And Shakespeare edged his way to doing this, you see, right from the beginning in the Comedy of Errors, as I said, and right till the very end. The late period, King Lear, the romances, women seem to play a central part in his plays. And they're, as I said, full of contradictions. We see the tension pulling back towards feudalism on the one hand, and tugging forward towards the new individualism, which inadvertently, perhaps, the Reformation sparked off without meaning to, because they didn't have a very high opinion of women because of the Bible and other socioeconomic conditions, no doubt. But they had begun a revolution in the thinking behind religion, which focused on the individual and the reading of the Bible in your mother tongue. And I think these processes did indirectly spark off what has become later what we call a more fully developed feminism, leading to Mary Wollstonecraft a couple of centuries later. But she had her predecessors, as we saw, and Amelia Lanier was just one example I gave. There were others, the Countess of Pembroke, Sir Philip Sidney's mother, and so on. There were other women writing and putting their position, often using a pseudonym. But Amelia Lanier was original in putting her name to her poetry. And that historically is the first time that had happened. Women did write, but not under their own names. She's unique in that respect. And it's fascinating that she happens to be the leading candidate for the Dark Lady. The connection there is amazing. It was A.L. Rouse, the historian, who first picked her out as the likeliest candidate for this mysterious woman, if she existed. It sounds to me all too real, as you saw from the poem I quoted. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. This is not just playing at poetry. It's describing a real person who is all too human, all too frail, all too imperfect, and yet is madly in love with her. But is madly in love with a young man. So you see what I mean about Shakespeare being radical by definition, contradictory by definition. Is he crazy about men, or is he crazy about women? And the same thing comes up in As You Like It, where Rosalind is both a man who is fallen in love with and a woman who is fallen in love with. It's the same person. This kind of split sexuality, the gender bending, as I called it, it's so ubiquitous in Shakespeare. Whether he knew it or not, whoever he was against his wishes, I think, quite radical, revolutionary. And to pigeonhole him as a conservative and handing him over to the Tories like this is, I think, grossly underestimating the power of Shakespeare. It's just bringing out the power. You need the right directors to do this. You need the right approach to bring out the radicalism of Shakespeare. But instead, we get the tourist industry pandered to, most of the time. And a lot of the real power of Shakespeare gets lost in this, wishy-washy idealization of a bard who can do no wrong and who is the embodiment of everything patriotic and British and so on.
The gender bending thing is very interesting, I think, especially if you look at it today and in the whole debate around trans issues.
Yes, indeed.
I often think both sides of the debate are so stuck in the either or. You can't be a woman because this and that. You can't be, and then but the other side as well. Where you have to go.
Well, that is
total
really ahead of its
operation
time,
to
isn't
be
it?
either or. Whereas, in the past, it was actually
the
more
whole
liberated.
the transgender debate is a fairly recent one, I suppose, and wokeism and all the rest of it. And here we are, going back to Shakespeare and stumbling onto him, anticipating the whole transgender thing with the convention of the boy actor. And as I said, the way he uses it, having, men falling in love with another man without realizing it. And sometimes the disguise is dropped, as in The Merchant of Venice, where Antonio and Bassanio, whatever his name is, yes, they quite openly affectionate. And there's a crypto-homoerotic relationship there, which he doesn't bring out explicitly. And we see the same in Twelfth Night, where there's another Antonio who is also in love with a young man, Sebastian. And again, that's hinted at rather than explored. But using the convention of the boy actor, Shakespeare can explore sexuality and the diversity of gender roles and gender attraction quite safely, because the convention is there. And it can be a bit of a laugh. And behind the comedy, I think some very radical points are being made or accepted tacitly. If you asked him, he probably wouldn't know what you were talking about, just writing a piece of entertainment. But these conventions, they express ideas perhaps beyond the conscious awareness of the writers themselves. And the play is more than just the individual writer's intention. The text is there. It has a life of its own. And over the ages, it's interpreted in different ways. And here we are in the 21st century, able to see transgender issues in Shakespeare, whereas Dr. Johnson in the 18th century would have seen something completely different. So that is for all ages, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's going back as well, isn't it? This whole idea of playing with gender and sort of, Urkommunismus, as Marx and Engels called it.
Well, it's back now, and it's quite fashionable.
Played with those roles all the time.
Yeah, and he did it, you see. He did it. It dropped out of favor when the Restoration came and women were allowed onto the stage, and the stereotypes prevailed. But there you are. I think Shakespeare does break the stereotypes consciously and sometimes inadvertently. And that makes him fascinating, endlessly relevant. And for those reasons, not because of bardolatry and blind worship of this patriotic figure. But there you go, matter of opinion.
Yes. What about then the Dark Lady, Amelia Bassano, Lanier Bassano? There's also speculation when you Google it, that she was actually, if Shakespeare was more than one person, that she might have been part of the writing team.
Well, you see, that's exactly what Jodie Picoult says in her novel, which, as I said, I read, and it's okay. It's a bit of a potboiler, but she writes well, and that's the implication. Now she goes the whole hog and makes her the exclusive author, which I think really is self-defeating. But that there are influences in these plays, as I've said before, from other authors, that there is a co-authorship element there is widely now officially accepted. He was not a sole individual genius in his garret working all alone. He worked with Middleton, he worked with Fletcher, he worked with Thomas Nash, he worked with Christopher Marlowe. We know this now almost factually. So whether women were involved, we know that the Countess of Pembroke was a huge patron of the arts. And all these artists, the university wits and Shakespeare seem to have gathered around her coterie of literary men and women, but she wrote herself poetry as the Countess of Pembroke, the Sidney family. And Emilia Bassano is part of the court circle. Again, we find the Dark Lady not on the streets, except for the case of Lucy Negro. One candidate is a black woman called Lucy Negro. It's a pure hypothesis that she may have been the Dark Lady. But the favorite candidate, as we've said, is Emilia Bassano. And she was a musician, and the Dark Lady is a musician. We see that in some of the sonnets, the musical metaphor. She was of Italian origin. She was probably dark. Her life story fits into the plausible scenario of her being Shakespeare's Dark Lady. We will never know, but we can speculate. But the interesting thing is that the woman belongs to a courtly circle. It's a highly educated woman, as only women in the court would be. Elizabeth herself, highly educated woman. And so it's a fascinating connection, and perhaps the mystery will always be there. But what I'm looking at is the actual themes and the implications of these themes in our terms today, and why they are still of interest. The biography, if you like, is the starting point, and the mystery of the biography. But the ideas, I think, should be debated and explored openly and imaginatively.
Yes. Let's get back to the Taming of the Shrew, the ending. You did ask me when we recorded it first, and I didn't have a very good answer. I've been thinking about it some more. You've been saying in your opening, you think she's at the end, when she's talking about you have to be obedience to your husband, and etc. You said that she might just be poking fun at him or at the audience, etc. Could she also just be turning the tables a little bit, that she's now playing his game and, she's gonna poke him, etc., that they've actually come to a sort of arrangement, Yeah. Is there a way to not have it as a really misogynist ending?
Yes, there is. All we know is that in all the other 40 plays, there's about 40 of them now in the canon, this is not what Shakespeare says about women, that you should get down on your knees, shut your mouth, and be bullied by your husband. He contradicts this time and time again. Well, the works, and whoever was behind them, contradicts this stereotype. So for me, to accept Katerina's volte-face, as I called it, a change of position from one extreme to the other, as meant to be taken without question, goes against the grain of the whole corpus of Shakespeare's plays, where we have Rosalind, we have Cleopatra, we have Lady Macbeth, we have all these women who do not fit into this mold. Now, why would Shakespeare seriously, present a woman like Caterina who fights Petruchio all the way for most of the play? Why would he then say, look, your real place is, as Calvin would say, or Luther, is to just sit at home and be my carer, and I'll protect you in this feudal way that I referred to? I think we have to take it as a convention. A comedy has to end in a comedic way, with marriage and some kind of reconciliation. Here, I think there's an element of tongue-in-cheek, and there's an element of, let's see where this can take us dramatically. And I think the irony is part of the theatrical experiment that Shakespeare was trying out in The Taming of the Shrew. And it's ironic, as I said, there was another play written in response to it called The Tamer Tamed. So it was an ongoing debate about the role of women in Elizabethan times. And I think it's good to see The Taming of the Shrew as part of this theatrical debate that was going on, because we see Shakespeare had completely different views in other plays. So why would he seriously tell us? It's an early play anyway, comes very early in Shakespeare's career. And if it were the case that he meant us to take it literally, he certainly changed his mind by the time he got to Othello and all the other plays I mentioned.
Yeah. Ian wants to come in. If anybody else would like to come in, please click raise hand or put your question in the Q&A.
Well,
Hello, Ian.
Hi. First of all, thank you. A magnificent lecture. I just so wish I'd done your course. Anyway, I just wanted to ask about psychoanalysis, which is, I know, a bit of a sidestep, but psychoanalysis has played a part in the literary criticism of Shakespeare. Do you feel it has any part to play, really? One of the things I find interesting is the question of the bestial in Shakespeare. So whether it's Caliban or whether it's Othello or whether it's Puck or whatever, the idea of a kind of bestial id type figure in the context of Shakespeare's plays, and whether that has anything to offer. And what I found so fascinating about your presentation this evening was its relationship to what Freud would have called the polymorphous perversity of what it is to be human. The idea of there is a sense in which sexuality is somewhat fluid, and in Shakespeare's day, maybe that was physically expressed in more than one.
Shakespeare's yeah.
And then the other question I wanted to ask was about property, about racism. There's a tendency to think about the race, and it didn't have the same meaning then. So Othello wasn't necessarily inferior because he was black. That's something we've superimposed onto it. Was Othello just simply an expression of a notion of a martial race? And also, with that, it imposed a kind of a masculinity, which ties in with the other kind of point that I was making. I think, just that really. Thank you.
Well, on the Freudian point you made, Shakespeare, as I said, anticipates so many currents that came later, including Freud. And we know that Freud and his mate Ernest Jones wrote a whole book about Hamlet and the Oedipus complex. So as far as the Freudian subconscious and Hamlet's relationship with his mother and her sexuality, frailty, thy name is woman. Frailty, remember, is a sexual frailty. Freud could very plausibly, or Ernest Jones, talk about the Oedipus complex. And theatrical productions nowadays very often show Hamlet, acting out the Freudian interpretation. I think Laurence Olivier's version was also influenced by Freud, and the idea that he's in love or jealous of Gertrude marrying his uncle and so on. The bestiality, I pointed out that Titania, that's bestiality in a very obvious way, where she wants to make love with a donkey, albeit in her dreams, her subconscious dreams. That's Freudian, you see, because it's a Midsummer Night's Dream, remember. and she's dreaming of having sex with a donkey. And it's hilarious, of course, and beautiful poetry. It is a most remarkable play. And that's incredibly Freudian. The fact that he's got dream in the title is an interesting coincidence in terms of Freud and the interpretation of dreams. And of all things, I mean, not only does he have the couples swapping partners left, right, and center, and Titania loving a little boy, a little Indian boy. You may not remember the details of the plot, Ian, I don't know. And both Titania and Oberon, her husband, both fancy this young Indian boy. There's a kind of erotic attachment to this servant boy that they're fighting over. They're squabbling. So there's another Freudian element. The couple there, the married couple, Oberon, Titania, fighting over the little boy, the Indian boy, and there's Titania then finding time to want to make love to Bottom, the weaver, who is actually a donkey at that particular point. It's one of the most marvelous, magical moments in the whole of Shakespeare. And the poetry of Midsummer Night's Dream is really beyond belief, just, the sheer beauty of it. So I think you can find Freud all over the place, in Shakespeare, as you can find whatever you like, whether it's Marx or whether it's Christianity, whether it's monarchism or anti-monarchism. All human life is there. It really is a secular Bible for many people. Now, as for the racism, I think the remarkable thing about Othello is that he doesn't fit the stereotype. He's a fully rounded human being, unlike Christopher Marlowe's treatment of race, which is one-dimensional, and other contemporaries. His treatment, Shakespeare's treatment of Othello, is that he's noble, that he's a poet. I mean, he speaks like a poet. His imagination is so magically attractive to Desdemona. The things he says, the way he says them, his courage, his calm, his expertise, as you said, in martial terms. But the obvious thing to say is not that Shakespeare's a racist because he has a black man kill his white wife out of jealousy. This is not suggesting that all black people go around killing their white partners. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, black men, as white men, have passions. They can be as jealous as any man. I don't think Shakespeare anywhere says it's because he's black that he does what he does. You see, it's because he's a human being. It happens he's black, and he has Desdemona saying, this lady from the Venetian elite running off with a black man and living with him because he's a decent human being, because she saw Othello's visage in his mind. And to say, look at a man's mind, not the color of his skin, is still radical today in the England that you live in and in the Greece that I live in, to say that so powerfully. And the racist is Iago, not Shakespeare. He has a character who embodies racism. And we don't say, well, Shakespeare's saying that all white men are therefore like Iago, who's a villain and who kills his wife, Emilia, So I don't think we should generalize and ban Othello, the great white bard, approach to Shakespeare, that he's, it's wokeism at its worst, when you end up saying, well, we can't have the Taming of the Shrew because of the ending. We ban that. We drop it. We don't give it a place. And Othello, well, that's a bit racist. We'll drop that as well. Oh, and Shylock, yes. Oh, that's anti-Jewish. Let's drop that. I mean, you could do that with most of the plays, and you'd end up with very little. I think they're there, these plays, with all their faults, with all their contradictions, and we should be, strong enough to face their cultural givens. They belong to their time, and we should explore them and respect them as products of a particular historical period, which brings us back to Marx, and beginning with history and talking about historical and socioeconomic circumstances, and not these, facile generalizations about, racism and whatever, and prejudice, We're all prejudiced. Nobody's perfect, and that's what Shakespeare shows time and time again. The imperfections of human beings, and yet the beauty, the paragon of animals, for all our contradictions.
I think Ian's got a follow-up question. Go on.
Well, less of a question, just simply to agree with you, really. I mean, Othello is not a racial figure, except insofar as he embodies a kind of notion of a martial race and of a sense of passionate duty, in a sense.
But so does Coriolanus.
I don't believe
Coriolanus is martial, but he's white. I mean, his martial aspect is one aspect of his character. Clearly, the Venetian state used, Moors, as they were called, from North Africa, in their armies. They used mercenaries. They did all kinds of things for very pragmatic purposes. Now, his initial role, of course, is as a general, as a very effective, martial figure. But there's so much more to him than that. His travels, his experiences about which he's so eloquent, his modesty, his qualities, his virtues, until he is trapped, like any of us, like Leontes in A Winter's Tale, who also becomes jealous. He's white. He becomes jealous of Hermione in The Winter's Tale. There's jealousy again. And jealousy is a theme that runs throughout Shakespeare. It just happens that in this case, it's a black man who happens to be a military figure. And he gets violent. It may be because he's a military figure, not because he's black, that he knows how to solve problems in a violent way. That's his job. And, because we see in Shakespeare white men killing people, their wives, whoever, time and time again. And we don't generalize from that all white men are, kind of villains and potential murderers. So, yeah, it's an interesting debate about racism and Othello, and whether it should be played, and whether white actors should black up and perform Othello as they have done in the past, and whether that is a racist action in itself. It's another debate, but it's an interesting one. Yeah. The play's the thing, as Hamlet says, Ian. The play's the thing.
Luke, I was going to ask you a little bit, getting back to right at the beginning of your presentation, which is the presentation of working class women as either, really rough or crude or prostitutes or, so not really on the stage of history. I guess the same goes with working class men. Yeah. Do you think, I mean, I know you've been saying, he was from the higher levels of society, etc. Do you think it has to do with the fact that at that time he was concentrating on the layers of society that were making history, that had sort of the most interesting trajectory at that time? You had peasants' revolt before, and you had levelers and Chartists after. But at the time of his writing, it was the nascent bourgeoisie, wasn't it? That was.
Yes, as you know, Tina, that is one view of history, that it's great men and important figures higher up in society that historians have often focused on, and not on what was going on at grassroots level. Now, we don't accept that. The very fact that this forum exists is that we look at the invisible participants in history, the people behind the Peasants' Revolt and other peasants' revolts that followed, and it's equally a choice of the writer to choose to focus on people like the peasants as we saw Henry VI in the revolt he presents, Jack Cade's Revolt, and in other plays, in Julius Caesar, we do see the people. They do have a kind of, they come on and they behave as a bit of a mob. Very few of them are separated out as individuals. And so he does have opportunities to show them as protagonists, even, you know, when they're in conflict with the ruling elite, as we saw in Coriolanus, and we see in Julius Caesar, that people are very much a part of it, but they are kind of looked down upon. And I don't know whether it's because Shakespeare was not the guy from Stratford, but some kind of member of the court, but he seems to identify with court ideology, let me put it that way. There is a clear default position from which he seems to be looking at historical events. Yes, you're right. And he goes back time and time again to the nobles, the aristocrats. We saw in Henry V how the important victims of Agincourt are the named aristocrats, and all the rest are the also-rans, the anonymous cannon fodder that Falstaff talks about. Food for powder, food for powder. So Shakespeare is very conscious that he's editing ordinary people out of history as if their lives don't matter. And that is very much a point that is made by him in Henry V himself. He knows that he's been naughty, and they're treating ordinary people as cannon fodder, whose names we don't know, the unknown soldiers. And the ones who matter are the few, the happy few, the aristocrats, with names like counties of England. You see, they're the ones who come down in history. So there are other playwrights, though, of the time, Thomas Dekker, Ben Jonson, who do focus on other classes apart from the aristocracy. Shakespeare is the one who's obsessed with the aristocracy. The Shoemaker's Holiday, Thomas Dekker, and others, they do look further down the social scale. So the option was there. This guy, as Adrian Noble, the RSC director, said at the end of, you know, the quotation, that he was a monarchist, a bourgeois, conservative, a Tory twit. It's a bit unfair, but that's what Adrian Noble said. I can see where he's coming from when he sees that. But I would have thought Adrian would be much more critical of the texts than to accept at face value the conservative appropriation of the Bard of Avon. You see what I mean? We tried to go a bit further here, and I hope we have done plausibly by going back to the text again and again and showing that whoever this man was, he was riven with contradictions. He was deeply disillusioned with the order of things. And that's what makes Hamlet great. It's what makes King Lear great. You see all this questioning, this doubt, you know, that things are falling apart, and he's pretty pissed off with it. And that's where he gets his characters running off to the forest time and time again to escape the corrupt court. It's an obsession. Get away from the corrupt court. Go out into the countryside. You see what I mean? Another world. The world turned upside down. And then he comes back to reality because he was a member of his own period. He belongs in the 16th century and 17th Jacobean period. And in the end, he comes back to the default position. But he leaves us with all of these questions. And that's what we've been exploring. Questions. Let's keep questioning. That's all we can do.
Absolutely.
And be dialectical, as we were taught to be. And find a synthesis. He didn't find the synthesis. We find the thesis. We find the antithesis very often. The synthesis we have to, I think, come up with ourselves. That's my view. But it's there for us to work on, to continue. As Tony Benn said, each generation takes up the struggle time and time again for democracy. So that's what we have to do. Each generation has to go back and continue to question and struggle for something better. Another world is possible. That's what I've been trying to say.
Very good summing up. And you have very much succeeded in bringing him to today. And of
I
course, we
hope so.
remember that
Yeah.
Karl Marx was a big fan of Shakespeare
Yeah.
as well. And you
And we
can't.
see now why he was.
Absolutely, yes. And he's looking at how society changes, doesn't it? And how it's overturned, how things are overturned.
And Marx loved contradictions, and
Yeah.
he loved, Hegel and stuff like that. And Shakespeare was, he anticipates Hegel as well, and all this, thesis and antithesis business. Am I don't know, perhaps reading too much into him. But I think it's his human instinct. And after all, these great philosophers and political theorists, they are, drawing on human experience, just like Shakespeare was. And perhaps they felt similar things to Shakespeare. They saw similar things. And Marx went one particular way. Shakespeare went his own way, appropriate to his own time. But so there you go. Endlessly fascinating.
And if you have other subjects that you find within Shakespeare,
If my health permits, I'd love to do more, as you know. But
very happy to feature you.
as they say, salud sobre todo, health above all.
Yes, if you're feeling well enough, it would be greatly
All
appreciated.
work. I was told by my partner this evening, well, you haven't done one on Shakespeare and religion. Perhaps we should look at Shakespeare's controversial relationship with religion or what he believed, because he's not obviously Catholic, he's not obviously Protestant, seems to be at times a bit of an atheist, at least an agnostic. He's again a mystery as far as religion goes. He doesn't fit in at all.
Sounds very interesting.
Yeah, that's a nice subject.
That'd be
Nice.
you have an open door here.
I'll start working on it.
Brilliant. Get right onto it tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for those who are still here. I
you.
see some people are still around.
We've got quite a lot of people still around. We had over 50
Time for my
people.
bedtime. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming along. Take care.
You are, of course, in Greece, so it's 2 hours later, so we'll let you go now. Thank you, Luke. Comrades, next week we have a double bill. We've got Deeper Driver. We'll be talking about Guantanamo and some of its survivors. There's been some news recently as well. There's still 15 people in Guantanamo, and this will be accompanied with a book review, a short book review, which we're going to be having more regularly by Mizano Rahman, a comrade who's doing book reviews regularly. If anybody would like to do similar reviews, films, TV series, something short, that would be fantastic, and we'd be happy to feature some of them. Just get in touch, info@ymarks.com. Thank you very much, comrades, and we'll see you next week, 6:30 from now on.